Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the vast, intimidating ocean of knowledge and distill it into the crucial, fascinating droplets you need to know.
Today, we are wading into some very deep waters. We're exploring a figure whose name is, well, basically synonymous with genius.
But whose professional life was, constantly marked by conflict. He was even called old-fashioned, and his work was, for a long time, nearly lost.
We're talking about Johann Sebastian Bach, born March 31st, 1685. And if you only know him as, like, the quintessential classical music guy, you should prepare to have that image completely transformed.
Right. The central paradox here is really the starting point for our deep dive, isn't it?
It is. He is now, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, arguably the most recognized and influential composer in all of Western music.
Yet, toward the end of his own life, his style, this incredibly intricate, complex style, was being viewed as, well, difficult.
Difficult, dense, and distinctly passé. Old-fashioned. The musical world was already moving on to the lighter, gallant style, which was, the precursor to the whole classical era.
Okay, so let's unpack this unexpected giant. The sources we've looked at all highlight the sheer scale of his output.
And the breathtaking diversity. I mean, we are talking about a composer who touched nearly every single genre available to him in the Baroque period.
Leaving behind hundreds and hundreds of cantatas, both sacred and secular. It's just staggering to even consider the volume of it all.
It is. And that diversity, it really speaks to his absolute mastery. His catalog forms the fundamental architecture of the High Baroque era.
And it covers every possible instrumental and vocal combination you can think of.
Exactly. Think about the foundational works. For orchestral music, you've got the 6 Brandenburg concertos and those incredibly intimate but technically demanding cello suites.
And then for the keyboard, we have cornerstones like the Goldberg variations, which are just this profound exploration of architecture and emotion, and of course the well-tempered clavier.
And that's before we even get to the sacred music. The towering choral monuments like the St. Matthew Passion and the complete Mass in B minor.
And that list, as you said, is just a tiny sliver of his repertoire. It also includes Latin church music, oratorios, motets, and just so many complex organ works.
He wrote music that somehow appeals equally to, like, a mathematician, a theologian, and a pure emotional listener all at the same time.
Precisely. And that synthesis, that ability to connect intellectual rigor with such profound emotion, is what makes this deep dive so compelling.
So what's our mission today as we plunge into these sources and, into his life?
Our mission is to understand the core engine of his genius, the mechanism by which he became the learned musician.
Okay.
Specifically, we want to know how Bach, who was so deeply rooted in German tradition and who never even traveled to the major cultural hubs like Italy or France.
How did he manage to so profoundly enrich that German style?
Yes. We'll trace how he achieved this through his rigorous mastery of counterpoint, that weaving of independent melodies.
And his meticulous, almost scholarly adaptation of those foreign Italian and French rhythms and forms.
And crucially, we're going to trace his often turbulent career, which was just defined by fights with his employers.
And then detail that dramatic 19th century revival that ultimately enshrined him as this global, timeless icon, overcoming decades and decades of obscurity.
The story starts not just with one individual talent, but with an entire musical lineage. A dynasty, really.
That's the perfect word for it. Bach was born in the town of Eisenach as the youngest of 8 children. His father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, was the director of the town musicians.
So this wasn't a family that just, happened upon music.
No, not at all. This was a dynasty woven into the very fabric of the regional culture.
That's a crucial distinction to make right from the start.
It is. The Bach family tradition, which you can trace all the way back to a patriarch named Vitus Weitbach, produced 3 to 4 generations of professional musicians.
And this network was intensely localized, right? Concentrated heavily in that central German region of Thuringia.
Exactly. If you were a Bach in this region, chances are you were a musician. It was the family business.
So he was born into what you'd call a highly conservative musical environment. I imagine that provided stability, but maybe it also restricted the flow of radically new ideas.
It provided extraordinary stability and foundational training. I mean, musical instruction was practically a birthright for him, and it was a guaranteed profession.
His father, Johann Ambrosius, must have taught him the basics.
For sure. He certainly taught him the basics of violin and music theory. But just as important were his uncles. They were church organists and court chamber musicians, and they exposed him to the professional circuit.
So it was a rigorous familial apprenticeship.
It was, and it instilled this deep respect for tradition, a tradition he would later, systematically master and then completely transcend.
But this early stability was just shattered by this immense personal tragedy. It transforms him into what the sources call an orphaned learner.
Yes, the period between his 9th and 10th birthdays was just devastating. His mother, Elizabeth Lemmerhirt, died in 1694.
And then his father passed away not long after.
Just 8 months later, in February 1695, Johann Sebastian was only 10 years old. He was suddenly stripped of both his parents and his home.
That must have been an incredible shock. It forces you to grow up very, very fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the trauma seems to have just galvanized his intellectual drive. He moved in with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach, who was the organist at St. Michael's Church in Ohrdruf.
And his brother became his primary musical mentor.
He did. And this move catalyzed Bach's intense, almost legendary hunger for musical knowledge.
And this is where we get that famous anecdote about his learning process, the dedication that really defined his whole self-education. Tell us about the secret copying.
This is one of the most revealing biographical details we have. While living with his brother, Bach studied, he performed, and he meticulously copied music.
But his brother, Johann Christoph, had a locked cabinet with a collection of valuable contemporary scores.
Right, and he forbade Sebastian from accessing them. And you have to ask why.
Well, in the late 17th century, music paper ledger paper was incredibly expensive.
Incredibly expensive. And original scores were highly valuable intellectual property. They were considered private, almost secret.
So the scores were locked away, but the young Bach found a way around it.
He did. He was driven by this almost desperate need to absorb this knowledge. And he found a way to retrieve the scores from the cabinet.
And the legend, recounted by his own son, C.P.E. Bach, is that he would copy them out meticulously by moonlight.
For 6 months. 6 months of difficult nocturnal labor because he didn't dare light a candle for fear of being discovered.
Wow. 6 months copying by moonlight. That's not just copying, that's actively performing the music in your head.
You're absorbing every note, every harmony, every structural choice through the physical labor of your own hand.
Exactly. This act of, intellectual espionage was Bach's equivalent of a world tour.
It was. It allowed him this early exposure to a comprehensive range of national styles that defined the late Baroque. You had the South Germans like Pachelbel and Carrel, who were masters of keyboard fugues.
Then the rigorous North Germans like Buxtehude and Johann Adam Reinken.
And the rhythmic French influence of Lully, and the melodic and structural Italian mastery of Frescobaldi.
He didn't just passively receive a musical education. He absorbed the entire contemporary European musical landscape through the sheer dedication of his own effort.
And that experience really sets him up as a true learned musician from the very start, synthesizing everything he could get his hands on.
Then, at age 15, he makes this massive physical move north.
Yes, in April of 1700, Bach moves north to Lüneburg with his school friend Georg Erdmann. The distance was immense, over 300 kilometers.
And the sources indicate the journey itself was undertaken mostly on foot.
Essentially a 2-week walk for a 15-year-old boy. He went to Lüneburg to enroll at the prestigious St. Michael's School Choir.
So why Lüneburg? What did that environment offer that Ohrdruf could not?
Lüneburg offered exposure far beyond those conservative Thuringian circles. He continued his studies, he sang in the choir, and he received crucial organ lessons.
But maybe most significantly, he came into contact with the sons of aristocrats who attended the nearby Ritter Academy.
And that broadened his intellectual and social horizons dramatically. He was able to study the latest music from foreign courts, and crucially, he was close enough to Hamburg to make trips to hear Reinken, one of the greatest living organists.
So that begins the sort of pilgrimage tradition that would define his early career.
After Lüneburg, his official professional career began. He was 18.
Right. In 1703, he started at the court of Duke Johann Ernst III in Weimar. The title sounds prestigious, court musician, but the sources imply his initial duties were pretty menial.
Oh, definitely. Possibly just a violinist. They certainly weren't senior roles.
But his reputation as a keyboard virtuoso was already spreading like wildfire.
It was, likely because of his deep study and those trips to Hamburg, and this led almost immediately to a significant upgrade later that same year.
He transitioned to Arnstadt, about 30 kilometers away, to become the organist at the new church.
Which is now, very appropriately, called the Bach Church.
So what made Arnstadt such a good starting point for a young, ambitious composer?
It was almost ideal for him structurally, if not, socially. First, the duties were relatively light, and the salary was surprisingly generous for an 18-year-old.
Which meant he had time to compose and practice.
And second, and this is crucial, the church featured a new organ that was tuned in a well-tempered temperament.
Let's pause on that term, well-tempered. For someone listening, why is that technical detail so important?
Okay, think of it this way. Traditional tuning systems, like mean tone, made music in certain keys sound absolutely beautiful, pure, and resonant. But if you tried to modulate, to change keys, too far away from that starting key, the intervals became violently dissonant, unbearable. Some keys were essentially unusable.
So the well-tempered system was a compromise.
A brilliant compromise. It made every key slightly impure, but critically equally acceptable.
So this organ was basically inviting radical harmonic exploration across all 24 major and minor keys.
And Bach, with his intense curiosity, was the ideal person to accept that invitation.
So he has the time, the talent, and the instrument. This brings us to that famous anecdote, the ultimate example of a musician prioritizing education over employment, the illegal sabbatical to Lübeck.
It is the defining moment of his professional apprenticeship. In 1705, Bach requested 4 weeks of leave from Arnstadt.
But he ended up being absent for around 4 months.
Yes, and the purpose was a 450-kilometer journey, which is about 280 miles, reportedly undertaken entirely on foot each way.
Just to hear and study with the great master of the North German Baroque, Diederik Buxtehude in Lübeck.
That's 900 kilometers round trip on foot in winter conditions, just to sit and listen and learn. That is dedication bordering on obsession.
It really speaks volumes about his character, doesn't it?
It does. He wasn't just attending concerts. He was likely absorbing Buxtehude's masterful improvisational skills and his famous Abendmusik in these evening concerts that were cultural phenomena.
And he also wanted to study with Johann Adam Reinken,
whose monumental work and Wasserfluss in Babylon, Bach had copied years earlier by moonlight. These 4 months were a foundational masterclass for him.
So he returns after this epic pilgrimage, filled with inspiration and new ideas, only to face a formal indictment from the Arnstadt church authorities.
Well, the 4-month unauthorized absence was certainly the primary administrative violation.
Sure, but formally, the indictment that followed gave a subtle and truly fascinating insight into his compositional trajectory.
He was accused of playing chorale accompaniments that were too elaborate, and crucially, of adding strange tones in his playing, which confused the already weak church singers.
Strange tones. That sounds less like a failure and more like a sign of, revolutionary genius. What were those strange tones?
They were the first tangible evidence of Bach pushing the boundaries of harmonic convention. The strange tones were Bach exploring those radical modulations we just discussed.
Changing key more quickly, more unexpectedly.
And pushing the music into distant, challenging, but ultimately beautiful places. He was leveraging the capabilities of that new, well-tempered organ to shatter the conservative musical expectations of Arnstadt.
It was the young, brilliant mind clashing directly with tradition. He was literally too far ahead of his choir.
That's a wonderful metaphor for his entire late career. He didn't stay long after that conflict. He moved on to Mühlhausen in 1707.
Correct. The conflict in Arnstadt just made his position untenable. So he sought and received the post at Blasius Church in Mühlhausen for better pay, better conditions, and specifically,
a better choir. He needed musicians who were capable of keeping up with his demands.
And this year, 1707, was a huge year of personal and professional milestones.
It was. Just 4 months after arriving in Mühlhausen, he married his second cousin, Maria Barbara Bach. It was the first of 2 critical marriages that would anchor his life.
And professionally.
In 1708, he wrote Gott ist mein König, BWV 71. It was a festive cantata composed for the inauguration of the new town council.
And because it was an official civic celebration, the council published the work at their own expense.
Right. And the historical footnote attached to Gott ist mein König is that it was the only extant cantata published during his entire lifetime.
Wow! Think about that. A composer who wrote hundreds of foundational pieces of the Western canon was known to the world through a single commissioned festive piece.
It just underscores how much of his work circulated only privately among musicians until well after he died.
So after that brief but formative stop in Mühlhausen, Bach returned to Weimar in 1708.
This marks the beginning of a sustained period of composing these large-scale instrumental works. He began as an organist and was promoted to Concertmeister, the director of music, by 1714.
So he was overseeing a large body of professional musicians in the court chapel.
And this second Weimar period, from 1708 to 1717, was critical for his self-imposed education. He understood his musical foundation was German and rigorous, but it lacked the rhythmic vitality and formal structure being developed abroad.
So he actively sought to master the Italian style, not by travel, but by intense transcription.
Precisely. Instead of undertaking that expensive, dangerous trip across the Alps to Venice, he sat at his desk and essentially reverse-engineered Vivaldi, Corelli, and Torelli.
This is one of the greatest examples of intellectual absorption in music history.
It is. He took string and wind concertos by Vivaldi works like L'Estro Armonico and transcribed them note for note for the harpsichord and organ.
He wasn't just making piano reductions. He was figuring out how to make a single keyboard instrument sound like an entire orchestra.
That's the genius of Bach. He internalized Vivaldi's dynamic rhythms, the bright, clear Italian melodic style, and most importantly, the ritornello form.
And for those unfamiliar, what exactly is ritornello form?
Think of it like a recurring architectural feature in a building. Ritornello means return in Italian. The orchestra plays a large, robust theme at the beginning.
And then the soloist comes in with brilliant, virtuosic material.
Right. Then the orchestra returns briefly to the ritornello, maybe in a different key. It creates this powerful, dramatic alternation soloist versus group, which was the engine of the Italian concerto.
And Bach took that structure, which was so clear and outwardly focused, and combined it with the internal, dense logic of the German fugue.
The result was not imitation, but synthesis. It was something entirely new and stronger. And it was during this time that he started composing the pieces that would eventually form the 2 volumes of the Well-Tempered Clavier.
His time in Weimar concluded, predictably, with another dramatic confrontation. This time it actually led to him being jailed.
Indeed. By 1717, Bach felt stifled. He believed the court environment was limiting his potential.
So he sought dismissal to take a new post as Kapellmeister for Prince Leopold in Köthen.
But his employer, Duke Wilhelm Ernst, disagreed violently. The court records are hilariously blunt about it.
They state that Bach was jailed for nearly a month before receiving his unfavorable discharge.
Because he was too stubbornly forcing the issue of his dismissal.
Stubbornly forcing the issue. The sources certainly portray him as a man who was determined to control his artistic environment.
It was a fight for artistic autonomy in a system defined by patronage. Bach viewed his talents not as a service to be chained down, but as a resource to be maximized.
So if a patron couldn't match his ambition, he was ruthless in seeking the next opportunity.
That month in jail shows you how fiercely he advocated for himself. I mean, he literally went to prison to ensure he could move on to a better job.
So he leaves Weimar and enters what is known as his secular period in Köthen, serving as Kapellmeister for the court of Prince Leopold from 1717 to 1723.
And this change of scenery profoundly affected his output. Prince Leopold was a Calvinist.
And Calvinist worship traditionally did not use elaborate, complex music, unlike the Lutheran tradition Bach grew up in.
Which meant Bach wasn't required to produce a weekly cantata.
So if he wasn't writing sacred music, what was he writing?
He focused overwhelmingly on secular instrumental music, and this period gave us some of his most cherished works.
This is the era of the 6 cello suites, the sonatas and partitas for solo violin.
And of course, the full set of the 6 Brandenburg concertos. These concertos are just this incredible showcase of instrumental virtuosity and variety.
He gives these unusual solo roles to instruments like the trumpet, the oboe, and the recorder.
It's a demonstration of his total command over orchestration.
And speaking of contemporaries, this period also features that great historical footnote about Bach and Handel. It's so hard to believe they never met.
It is genuinely astonishing. It's almost tragic that these 2 titans, born in the same year, living relatively close by, only about 130 kilometers apart, never intersected.
The sources confirm Bach made the journey from Köthen to Halle in 1719, hoping to meet Handel.
He did. Handel was visiting his family, but he had already departed.
And there was a second attempt later on.
Yes, a formalized attempt failed in 1730. Bach's son, Wilhelm Friedemann, traveled to Halle with an invitation, but Handel was unable to accept.
They were parallel geniuses who shared the same aesthetic language and formative influences, yet they just ran on separate tracks forever.
It makes you wonder what a collaboration might have sounded like.
Yeah.
We're left only with the comparison of their independent masterpieces.
Professionally, Bach was soaring in Köthen, but personally, this period brought significant loss before he found stability again.
Yes, the sudden loss of his first wife. In 1720, while Bach was away in Carlsbad accompanying Prince Leopold, his first wife, Maria Barbara, died suddenly.
He returned to find her already buried.
It was a shattering tragedy. They had 7 children together, though only 4 survived into adulthood, including the composers Wilhelm Friedman and Carl Philipp Emanuel.
It left him a widower with 4 young children to raise while managing this busy court career.
But the sources show he found stability pretty quickly after this personal turmoil.
Thankfully, yes. A year later, in 1721, he met and married Anna Magdalena Wilke, a talented soprano 16 years his junior, who was also employed at the Köthen court.
And they had 13 children together, a truly staggering number 6, of whom survived to adulthood.
Including the later composers Johann Christoph Friedrich and Johann Christian.
So this vast family, spanning 2 marriages, ensured the continuation of the Bach musical dynasty, which is a critical element of his long-term legacy.
In 1723, Bach made the definitive move of his career to Leipzig, taking up the prestigious but ultimately immensely frustrating position of Thomas Cantor,
Director of church music. Leipzig was the bustling intellectual and commercial center of Protestant Germany. This was considered the leading cantorate in Protestant Germany.
This is a remarkable chapter, and the context of his appointment is vital for understanding his mindset.
It is, because Bach was actually the 3rd choice for the job.
No way. The post had first been offered to Georg Philipp Telemann and then Christoph Grobner.
Right. And crucially, both of them used the Leipzig offer as leverage to negotiate better terms where they were currently employed. They ultimately turned Leipzig down.
So Bach wasn't the first or even second choice for the most prestigious post. That seems astonishing given his current status.
It is, but it tells us his reputation was high, but maybe not as modern or fashionable as Telemann's or Graupner's.
But the job he accepted was monumentally demanding.
The mandate was essentially impossible. He had to direct St. Thomas School, meaning he was responsible for the moral, academic, and musical education of about 50 boarding students.
He had to provide music for 4 major churches every Sunday and feast day.
And he had to compose a new cantata for every single one of those Sundays and feast days in the liturgical calendar.
He was even assigned to teach Latin, although he quickly delegated that duty to 4 deputies, or prefects.
That is an administrative and creative burden that few modern professionals could even imagine. He effectively had to become a cantata machine.
He embraced it, though, with relentless energy. He assumed the office on May 30th, 1723.
And within 3 years, he had composed most of his hundreds of cantatas, organized into 5 annual cycles, 3 of which are still extant.
We estimate that over 100 cantatas composed during his Leipzig tenure have tragically been lost to time.
Which suggests the true depth of his output is even greater than we currently realize.
And that output wasn't just volume. It was systematic exploration. The sources note his commitment to the chorale cantata cycle.
Yes. Starting in 1724, he dedicated his 2nd annual cycle exclusively to chorale cantatas. This means each cantata was based entirely on a single, well-known Lutheran hymn or chorale.
Something like, "Watch it off, rift uns die shippers awake."
Exactly. This systematic method allowed him to integrate theology and music at the deepest level, transforming these simple congregational tunes into monumental, complex, dramatic statements. He used the established musical language of the church as his raw material.
These years also saw the creation of his monumental passion settings, the cornerstones of sacred music, the ultimate expressions of Lutheran piety.
Absolutely. The St. John Passion, which is so intense and dramatic, was followed by the monumental, profoundly contemplative St. Matthew Passion, which was first performed on Good Friday, April 11th, 1727.
These works are vast, complex, utilizing multiple choirs and orchestras. They represent the absolute apex of Baroque expression.
But despite this incredible creative productivity, Bach was constantly embroiled in conflict with his employers.
What was the root of the conflict with the Leipzig City Council?
It essentially boiled down to resources, artistic freedom, and status. Bach felt the council was penny-pinching in their funding of his music programs.
Particularly regarding the salaries and skill level of his choir students and instrumentalists.
And the council, in turn, felt Bach was too demanding, too stubborn, and spent too much time on secular music, prioritizing complex compositions that exceeded the simple requirements of the church service.
So it was just a continuous, often petty turf war.
It was, so he had to get politically shrewd to gain leverage against his stingy employers.
And his strategy for consolidating power was brilliant.
Oh.
Diversify his musical portfolio.
Exactly. In 1729, he made a very strategic political move by taking over the directorship of the Collegium Musicum.
This was a prominent secular performance ensemble, started by Telemann, composed mostly of talented university students and some professional musicians.
And by controlling a student orchestra, he expanded his domain. Suddenly, he wasn't just the church's servant. He was the head of Leipzig's secular musical life, independent of the church authorities.
He used the Collegium Musicum to perform his instrumental works, his Brandenburg concertos, his new keyboard concertos, in public, non-religious settings.
Often holding weekly, free concerts in venues like Café Zimmermann and its outdoor coffee garden during the summer months. This created a public power base for him.
And his ultimate political victory involved a mass and the King of Poland. He literally used the most ambitious musical project of his life as a bargaining chip.
That's the climax of his Leipzig political maneuvering. In 1733, Bach composed the Kyrie Gloria Mass in B minor and dedicated the manuscript to Augustus III of Poland,
Who was also the Catholic Elector of Saxony, a Lutheran cantor dedicating a Catholic mass setting to a Catholic king. That's a huge political calculation.
It was a necessary one. He was making a strategic, successful bid to persuade the prince to grant him the title of Royal Court Composer.
And receiving that prestigious official title in 1736 gave him crucial bargaining power and prestige that the Leipzig Council could not touch.
He was now answerable, in theory, to the king, not just the local administrators.
And he later expanded the setting into the complete towering mass in B minor.
A work of immense scale, complexity, and synthesis, uniting German and Italian styles. It was never performed in its entirety during his lifetime, but it stands as his ultimate theological and musical summation.
Justly considered among the greatest choral works in history. And these later Leipzig years also gave us the sprawling Christmas oratorio.
So we've traced the humble beginnings, the obsession with learning, the career battles, and the political maneuvering.
Now let's dissect the genius. All of those struggles culminated in a specific, rigorous musical language. What makes Bach's music sound like Bach? What was the DNA of the high Baroque architect?
It all boils down to two things: counterpoint and organization. Bach didn't just utilize counterpoint. He perfected it to an almost mathematical degree.
And counterpoint is, simply put, the art of weaving multiple independent melodic lines simultaneously.
Right. Instead of a single tune with accompaniment, you have 2, 3, or 4 equally important melodies happening all at once.
So if you're listening to a Bach piece, you shouldn't just be listening to the highest voice, the soprano. You should be listening to how the bass voice is arguing with the tenor while the alto is reflecting on the soprano.
Exactly. His first major biographer, Johann Nicholas Forkel, captured this perfectly when describing Bach's harmony.
He said it was an interweaving of independent melodies, so perfect in their union that each part seems to constitute the true melody.
Think of it like a complex, tightly woven tapestry, where every thread has its own beautiful curving path. But together they form one unified, strong image. It's musical engineering combined with emotional depth.
And the ultimate, most rigorous expression of that technique is the fugue.
The fugue is central to his style, the way the sonata form is central to the classical era. If counterpoint is the language, the fugue is the literary form.
And a fugue is a contrapuntal compositional technique built on a central musical theme, which we call the subject.
Yeah, a good analogy for the fugue structure for the listener might be a carefully orchestrated argument, or maybe a relay race.
A relay race. I like that.
The first runner, the first voice, starts with the main musical idea, the subject. As soon as that runner completes their statement, the second runner enters immediately, repeating that subject, often a perfect fifth, higher or lower. We call that the answer.
So now you have two independent melodic lines running simultaneously.
Right. The composition moves through an exposition where all voices state the subject, followed by episodes, which are connecting passages where the material is developed.
And then you get further entries of the subject in related keys, and it often returns triumphantly to the home key.
That takes incredible intellectual control. It's highly mathematical.
Yeah.
And Bach studied this form relentlessly through predecessors like Sweelinck and Buxtehude. He didn't invent the fugue.
But he exhausted its possibilities, mapping out every potential permutation and emotional capacity of the form.
Moving beyond the structural forms, the second key element we identified earlier, the one that got him into trouble in Arnstadt, was his innovative approach to harmony.
Those strange tones, they didn't disappear. They became deliberate, calculated innovation.
They absolutely did. They became modulation. Bach constantly pushed the boundaries of changing keys, venturing into harmonic regions that other composers of his time considered unplayable or too dissonant.
And his ultimate proof of concept for this, the statement that permanently changed music history, was the Well-Tempered Clavier.
2 books of preludes and fugues. And it was so revolutionary because it was a systematic test of the possibilities opened up by that well-tempered tuning system we discussed earlier.
Each book contains 24 pairs, a prelude and a fugue one for every single major key and every single minor key.
Prior to this, using keys like F-sharp major or C-sharp minor was rare to impossible because the tuning would just sound awful.
So by writing an entire monumental work that systematically proved the viability of using all 24 keys, Bach essentially unlocked the entire harmonic spectrum for every future composer.
He expanded the expressive, harmonic universe of his time permanently. It's not just a beautiful work. It's a technical declaration of independence for harmony.
Precisely. And he also revolutionized the way instruments interacted, particularly the keyboard instruments.
Yes. In Baroque concerted playing, the keyboard was typically restricted to a background role, the basso continuo.
Just simple harmonic and rhythmic accompaniment, filling in the chords.
Bach shattered this limitation. He pioneered the keyboard concerto genre, treating the harpsichord or organ as a true virtuosic soloist.
A soloist that could enter into a dramatic dialogue, a concertante relationship with the orchestra.
He began doing this systematically in instrumental cantata movements, starting in the 1720s. And it's difficult to overstate how major this was.
He was pioneering the keyboard concerto a full decade before his contemporary Handel published his first organ concertos.
By elevating the keyboard from background filler to foreground hero, he paved the way for the keyboard concertos of Mozart and Beethoven.
Finally, we can't talk about Bach's compositional DNA without discussing his artistic intent, which was so profoundly tied to his faith. He wasn't just writing music, he was performing an act of worship.
His hundreds of sacred works are universally seen as manifesting his deep personal faith and commitment to Orthodox Lutheranism. This wasn't just a job for him. It was a calling.
The Lutheran chorale, the hymn tune familiar to the congregation, was the fundamental basis for so much of his output.
He took these simple melodies and elaborated them into complex chorale preludes and cantata movements, making the familiar profound. And he didn't leave anything to chance.
There's a meticulousness to his planning that borders on the obsessive.
He gave meticulous attention to structure and lyrics, which often leads to complex numerological analyses by later scholars.
People who find patterns in the number of notes or bars corresponding to words like BACH, which translates to numbers 2138.
Whether that was intentional or accidental, it speaks to his deeply structured thinking. He was also highly engaged with the text authors, most famously collaborating with Picander for the St. Matthew Passion libretto.
Ensuring that the religious and musical expression in his large-scale vocal architecture were perfectly unified.
And he would often sign his scores, Soli Deo Gloria, SDG, for God alone be the glory. It just underscores his intent.
As we enter the 1740s, the musical world around Bach was shifting rapidly towards the lighter, simpler, gallant style.
Yet, Bach entered his final decade by deliberately doubling down on the density and complexity of his established style, creating what are often called his learned masterpieces.
That decision to dig deeper into his own complex language rather than chasing the new trend yielded extraordinary results.
It defines his final period. The first key late work is the musical offering from 1747. And this arose from a fascinating scenario. Bach visited the court of King Frederick II of Prussia.
Frederick the Great, who was a talented flutist and composer in his own right.
Yes. And Frederick challenged Bach to improvise a 6-part fugue on a musical theme of the king's own creation.
This theme, the thema regium, or king's theme, was notoriously tricky and difficult to use contrapuntally.
Bach obliged, improvising a magnificent 3-part fugue on the king's new fortepiano, an early version of the modern piano. But he promised Frederick something more.
And he delivered that something more back in Leipzig.
He composed and published an entire set of complex fugues, canons, and a trio sonata based systematically on that thema regium, dedicating the published work, the musical offering, to Frederick.
It was a dazzling display of intellectual and musical firepower, showing the young king precisely what an old master could do with his theme.
And the final monument he left behind, the magnum opus that was sadly incomplete, was a purely intellectual exploration of the fugal form.
That was the art of fugue, which he began around 1742.
It is his final, monumental work, a profound exploration of polyphonic structures and canons, which he was preparing for publication until shortly before his death.
What makes it so radical is that it's pure form. He chose not to specify the instrumentation.
It is written almost abstractly, reducing complex counterpoint to its bare essentials of melodic logic. It's a testament to the fact that the ideas themselves, the structural integrity, were what mattered most to him.
The sources mention a deeply tragic detail regarding the end of his life, his failing eyesight and the disastrous medical intervention he received.
It is a dark, unnecessary coda to a brilliant life, and it highlights the crude state of 18th century medicine. His failing eyesight led to 2 surgeries in 1750.
Performed by the visiting British surgeon John Taylor.
A man who is now widely understood today as a charlatan, a quack who traveled Europe, promising cures for cataracts.
And Taylor is linked to another monumental tragedy of the Baroque era, isn't he?
He is. Taylor is believed to have blinded hundreds of people, and famously, Bach's celebrated contemporary George Friedrich Handel suffered a similar loss of sight after Taylor operated on him.
The irony of these two musical giants who never met in life, sharing the same fate at the hands of the same charlatan, is just deeply poignant.
Bach never recovered from the trauma. He died on July 28, 1750, due to complications following these unsuccessful surgeries, after suffering a sudden stroke a few days prior.
And the lack of immediate recognition after his death seems compounded by the initial disposal of his remains.
It's almost unbelievable given his later status. He was the Thomas Cantor of Leipzig.
Yet Bach was originally buried at Old St. John's Cemetery in Leipzig, and his grave went completely unmarked for nearly 150 years.
His work and his physical remains were largely forgotten by the public. His remains were only identified during construction work in 1894 and moved to St. John's Church.
And then finally to their current deserved resting place in St. Thomas Church in 1950, marking the bicentennial of his death. It took 2 centuries for his body to find its final proper resting place.
Despite the lack of official state recognition, his immediate intellectual legacy was protected, thankfully, by his most diligent son.
Yes, his son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach C.P. Bach played a crucial, tireless role in safeguarding his father's memory.
C.P.E. Bach was a highly successful composer in his own right, working at the court of Frederick the Great. He saw to it that the unfinished Art of Fugue was published in 1751, a vital act of preservation.
And he diligently safeguarded many of his father's crucial manuscripts, including copies of the Well-Tempered Clavier and the Passions.
He prevented the wholesale loss of many works. He also co-authored the 1754 obituary, the Necrologue, which helped to establish the initial, definitive biographical record.
The 18th century, the decades immediately following his death, often treated Bach as an old master whose time had passed. This is the 18th century slumber.
What was happening in music that made his intricate style seem so out of step? Well, the prevailing taste was moving towards the gallant style.
Essentially, the emerging pop music of the day. Simple, elegant, melodic, and clear.
Think of it as musical rococo. Music was meant to be instantly digestible, appealing, and light, often built around a single, easily traceable melody with simple accompaniment.
Bach's dense, contrapuntal tapestries were the antithesis of this.
Exactly. He was primarily known to the public as an organ virtuoso and a teacher, not a composer of note. Critics like Johann Sebastian Bach openly suggested Bach should write less complex music.
The younger generation was actively moving away from complexity toward clarity, and this attitude of dismissiveness meant that many manuscripts were lost.
A considerable, permanent loss. Much of his work, including parts of Mass in B minor and many cantatas, simply sat in dusty archives or was distributed only among a very small circle of admirers.
But the seeds of the revival were already being planted secretly among a very discerning group of collectors and connoisseurs.
Absolutely. Bach had influential secret fans who acted as a bridge between the Baroque and classical eras. We have to highlight musicians and collectors like Sarah Itzig-Levy in Berlin.
And Baron Gottfried van Swieten in Vienna.
Van Swieten was a high-ranking Austrian official and music enthusiast who collected, copied, and hosted private performances of Bach's most complex works.
And why was he so important to the long-term legacy?
He was instrumental in passing Bach's legacy on directly to the next generation of composers, the Viennese school. He hosted regular salons where he introduced these composers to Bach's manuscripts, demanding that they study them.
And what did figures like Mozart and Beethoven think of him once they encountered these
They
scores?
were instantly converted. They studied him rigorously. Mozart encountered Bach's work in Van Sweeten's library
Mm.
and was just overwhelmed by the contrapuntal density.
He owned a copy of one of his motets and transcribed some of his instrumental works.
He immediately started incorporating more counterpoint into his own music. And even more famously, Ludwig van Beethoven learned the well-tempered clavier entirely by the time he was just 11 years old.
Beethoven called him the Urvater der Harmonie.
The progenitor of harmony. That quote shows that these masters recognized what the general public had overlooked. Bach was not just the end of the Baroque, he was the foundation upon which their classical and romantic structures were built.
He provided the deep grammatical understanding of harmony they needed to innovate. And here is where the 19th century explosion happens. If the rediscovery was a fire, who was the match that lit it?
That match was Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn himself, a young Jewish-German composer, organized and conducted the 1829 performance of the St. Matthew Passion in Berlin.
This was not only the first performance since Bach's death nearly 80 years earlier,
But it was done with a massive chorus and orchestra, introducing the sheer scale of Bach's sacred output to the German public. It was a cultural and musical watershed.
Mendelssohn's performance precipitated the full Bach Revival. It demonstrated that this old, forgotten music was not merely academic. It was profoundly moving, dramatic, and emotionally relevant.
The audience reaction was ecstatic, sparking a nationwide interest. And once that fire was lit, organizations sprang up to ensure his works were permanently recorded and accessible.
Which led directly to the founding of the Bach Gesellschaft, the Bach Society, in 1850, a century after his death.
Yes, initiated by influential figures like Robert Schumann. The completion of this massive, comprehensive edition by the end of the century was a monumental scholarly undertaking. It finally provided musicians and scholars with reliable access to Bach's entire known oeuvre.
And the 19th and 20th centuries didn't just play his music, they adapted it, sometimes controversially, to suit contemporary tastes.
Oh, the Romantics couldn't resist putting their own spin on him. We see this trend of romantic adaptations. Composers transcribe Bach to make him sound bigger, more lush, more appropriate for massive concert halls.
Like Robert Schumann's Six Fugues on the name Bach, which uses the musical motif derived from the German spelling of his name B-flat, A-C, B natural.
And of course, the incredibly popular example of Charles Gounod taking a simple, elegant Bach prelude and overlaying his Ave Maria melody on top of it.
Creating a new standard that often eclipses the original work in public memory. And this adaptation continued into the 20th century, bringing him into pop culture.
Absolutely. Arrangements like the air on the G string became pop culture fixtures, and Leopold Stokowski's dramatic, often criticized but undeniably powerful orchestration of the Toccata and Fugue in D minor was used to open Disney's 1940 masterpiece, Fantasia.
These adaptations ensured Bach's sound, if not always his pure form, reached millions of non-classical listeners.
But perhaps the most enduring modern legacy, one that brought his music back to its precise original structure, belongs to a very specific set of variations and a singular pianist.
That would be Glenn Gould and the Goldberg Variations. Gould's 1955 debut recording fundamentally transformed the work.
Prior to Gould, the Goldberg Variations were considered an obscure, esoteric piece of highly technical music for scholars and specialized harpsichordists. Gould played them on the piano with a startling clarity, rhythm, and speed.
And what was the Gould effect?
It was galvanic. His unique performance technique and interpretation galvanized a new generation of listeners, proving that Bach could be both mathematically rigorous and profoundly rhythmic and modern. That debut recording achieved astonishing sales figures for a classical record.
Moving the Goldberg Variations decisively into the standard repertoire. And finally, for the ultimate, most cosmic honor, Bach represents Earth to the universe.
It's the ultimate stamp of universal genius. When NASA was curating the contents of the Voyager Golden Record, the disc sent into interstellar space in 1977 as a representation of Earth's culture. 3 of his compositions were selected.
More than any other single composer. What were the 3 chosen pieces?
They were the first movement of Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, the Gavotte en Rondeau from the Partita for Violin No. 3, and the Prelude and Fugue No. 1 in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. His music is literally our planetary ambassador.
A universal language of complexity, synthesis, and order.
So what does this all mean for us? Bach's legacy is a profound testament to the power of synthesis and mastery. He didn't just exist within the Baroque era. He perfected its language.
He internalized global influences without traveling, mastered the dense architecture of counterpoint, and simultaneously laid the complex, necessary groundwork for future harmonic exploration.
He was the composer who synthesized centuries of musical history and pushed it forward, achieving a matchless combination of musical engineering and profound expressivity that somehow remains timeless.
He truly earned the title of the learned musician. And if you are a learner or someone dealing with information overload and the pressure of endless new trends today, Bach offers a fascinating and potent lesson.
Think about him late in his life, when the gallant style, the pop music of its day was emerging, and his own work was deemed old-fashioned and too complicated.
He faced a clear choice: conform and try to write the new, simpler music, or dig deeper into his own established rigor.
And he deliberately chose to dig deeper. He didn't chase the trend. He didn't simplify his message.
Instead, he committed his final years to creating the art of fugue, reducing complex counterpoint to its foundational, most rigorous intellectual form.
It was a final, unwavering commitment to enduring mastery, regardless of contemporary fashion.
This raises an important question for you, the listener. In our 21st century world of constant pressure to adopt the next big thing, what can we learn about enduring mastery from the composer who reacted to new trends by deliberately digging deeper into his own already established complex style?
Is the pursuit of deep, comprehensive skill, even when it feels out of step, ultimately the path to truly timeless, universal recognition?
That's something worth mulling over long after the music stops.